Hi everyone, welcome back to the Stitches and Scribbles channel. My name is Erin and I've got another podcast episode for you today. This is going to be my podcast for the month talking about everything that I read in February. If you're waiting for the Crafty podcast, that'll be up 2 weeks from when this video is posted. If you are here for the book stuff though, you're welcome to stay. So I actually have very few physical books I read to show you this month because most of the books I read are from my school library where I work, or they were ebooks or audiobooks, so I actually will only have one physical book to show you today that I already read. I do have a couple that I also acquired this month that I'll be showing you at the end of the video. So let's dive into what I read. The first book that I read for the month of February is the third, well, it says it's the third book. I actually read it as the fourth book in the City of Ember series. It's called The Diamond of Darkhold. I believe this one was the fourth one published, but the way the series works, there are 3 books, including this one, that deal with the main characters from the first book, The City of Ember, and one book that's kind of a prequel that has a different set of characters. That prequel book was, I believe, published third in the sequence, so sometimes it's labeled as number 3, versus Diamond of Darkhold, which is number 4. Yeah, I think that's what's happening here. So I read it as the fourth and final book in the series as it was published. But The Diamond of Darkhold follows our characters Lena and Dune from the original City of Ember book as they hear of a device that might be able to help the people of the village of Sparks have some more technology abilities that they didn't have previously. This was a really good wrap-up to the series. I did really enjoy the other 3 in the series as well. The Diamond of Darkhold definitely dealt with how do you share resources as a society and what happens when not everyone has access to those resources. So like I've said with the previous books in the series, this is a really interesting way to show kids how societies are built and how people establish rules and guidelines for people within a society in a fantasy sci-fi setting. I gave this one 4 stars. I did really enjoy it. There was a very satisfying wrap up to the series, as well as some new problems presented along the way. So really enjoyed this one. If you have a child in your life who's looking for a kind of dystopian series but isn't ready for something like The Hunger Games yet, or some of the more YA dystopian series, I think the City of Ember books would be a really good fit for someone who's interested in stuff like that. The second book I read in February was an audiobook, and it was A Natural History of Dragons, which is the first book in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series by Marie Brennan. And here's what it looked like. I gave this book 5 stars. I really, really loved this one. I mentioned, I think in my last reading podcast episode, that for a long time, historical fiction felt really cumbersome for me to read because I didn't understand enough of the historical backgrounds to really understand what was going on. And I have realized that something that I prefer is actually historical fantasy. So this series takes place in a world that's very much reminiscent of Victorian England, along with all of the kind of colonialism stuff that was going on in England at that time, except that all of the countries are fictional. So they don't use the names we're familiar with, but you can kind of tell what areas are supposed to be reminiscent of which countries. But it follows Isabella Trent, who is a female naturalist, again in kind of a Victorian England-esque society, only she is a naturalist studying dragons. So it feels like reading both a history textbook or like a science textbook and a fictional story. I'm also just now realizing that my my Storygraph thinks I've read this book twice and I've only read it once. I'm wondering if I made a mistake when documenting it and I already talked about this for my last video, but I'm not sure. Please correct me in the comments if I already talked about this one. I found myself so deeply immersed in this story despite it being a very kind of dry way of telling the stories, because it's written as if Isabella Trent is writing her memoirs as an older lady, and she's talking about her like childhood and early 20s. And there are 5 books in this series, so I'm actually currently reading the second one and also enjoying it. I gave this book 5 stars. If you're someone who wants kind of that historical fiction feel in a very different way, I would highly recommend this book. And also, if you like dragons, I would recommend this book. One of my criticisms recently with what's popular in fantasy is that romantasy has kind of taken over the fantasy market, especially when female main characters are concerned. So I liked that this was a female main character and that romance is part of the story, because part of the memoir aspect of it is that the main character does get married, but it's very much a side plot to what's actually going on. So I really appreciated that balance, and I think that that's something that is not being done as often now. The next book I read, I did read it as a physical copy, but I have since lent it to one friend and now another friend. But it was The Exorcist Files by Father Carlos Martins. I gave this one 5 stars, and this was my adoration book last month. For those of you who don't know, I have started going to adoration once a week, and I look for a Catholic book that I can read during that time. So since this is a Catholic book and a Catholic nonfiction book, that was my choice. This is heavily tied into the Exorcist Files podcast, which also features Father Carlos Martin. This book goes really in depth about some of his cases and also just some things to watch out for if demonic possession is something you're concerned about, which seems very kind of surreal to talk about, but it was a very interesting book. It has a lot of theology in it in a very approachable way. My one friend who's already read it said it did keep her up at night because she was kind of overthinking things. So I would recommend a good palate cleanser book after you read this, but I did find it really useful, and I think it's a really important thing to be reading if you are someone who practices their Catholic faith. Highly recommend. Up next is another historical fantasy book. This was Babel by R.F. Kuang. I read this as an ebook and I gave it 5 stars. This book also kind of takes place in Victorian era England, but really delves into colonialism and how countries with power were taking resources from countries without and how information was exchanged. But what was really interesting about this book was that the magic system that they use is based on translation. So the way to get magical things to happen is by translating words and inscribing them on silver bars so that they can be used to do a certain process. So then instead of talking purely about like physical goods and how they're used unethically with colonialist practices, we're talking about the language being used as a commodity. So what are the ethics of using words from a culture that is not accepted in the country it's being used in, and why is it just England that has the power to do all these translations and inscriptions? So it was a really interesting book. It felt like going back and forth between a really intense kind of underground vigilante fantasy novel and a linguistics textbook. But I really enjoyed it. I was so surprised when it was over because I was reading it as an ebook and thought I had 100 pages left, but the last 90 something pages are all like references and like a glossary. So the book felt like it had a very sudden end. So I will give you a warning on that one. The like footnotes and glossary section of the book is quite large. So expect the book to end sooner than you think it's going to. But I loved this one so much that I have now picked up a different book by this author that I'm also currently reading called The Poppy Wars. Up next, I was kind of on an audiobook kick, but I was looking for some kind of lower key audiobooks for a while I was waiting for the second Lady Trent book to come in on my Libby holds. So I decided to start rereading The Chronicles of Narnia. And the first one that I started with was The Magician's Nephew, which is the first chronologically. It's not the first in publishing order, but I prefer to read them chronologically. 5 stars, loved the audiobook adaptation. I've read this book many, many times. It's a kind of a familiar comfort read for me, so I enjoyed getting back into it, actually while I was shelving books at my day job as a school librarian. So it was nice to have a story in the background that I was already familiar with, so I didn't have to worry about missing things if I was concentrating too hard on reading a book label to put it back in the right place, but I still got to enjoy the story. The next book I read also came from my school library, and it's also a Catholic fantasy book for kids. This was The Relic of Perilous Falls, which is the first book in the Will Wilder series. I gave this one 4 stars. It's very much marketed as a book series that is meant for kids who like Percy Jackson. And I think the setup to the story was really good. It follows Will Wilder, who's I forget how old. Oh, it says he's 12 years old. Where he can kind of see dark creatures that appear in his hometown. And it also follows his family story of a missing relic that he has to recover. And it just deals a lot with, again, theology, but in a way that's very approachable to kids. I did enjoy this book. I probably won't personally be reading the rest of the series right now. I wanted to make sure I read the first one so that I had the ability to recommend it to my students. My only big criticism of it is I don't really like books that have a play-by-play for fight scenes. So if the scene is being described in such a way that like every single move is being detailed, that feels too long for me, and I don't enjoy the like back and forth of that. And there was kind of a lot of that in this book where it felt very like choreographed in the way that it was written during intense physical scenes. So that's the only reason that I didn't enjoy it. I felt myself kind of getting lost in those scenes, but that's one of my preferences as a reader. I know that some of my students really like books that are structured that way, but that is why I gave it 4 stars instead of 5. But again, if you have a like 4th grade to middle school age student who's looking for a new series to read, I would highly recommend this if you're looking for more books that show Catholic values and theology. And this was in a very approachable way for kids. Up next, I was continuing my Chronicles of Narnia reread with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Again, not much to say about this one. I've read it before. I loved the audiobook version. I got both of these on Audible, by the way. Yeah, it's a classic for a reason. It was a good comfort read. Absolutely loved it. The next book I read was a nonfiction book, so it was adding to my goal of reading nonfiction, which my 3 reading goals for the year were more nonfiction, more Catholic books, and more audiobooks, so clearly making good progress on that. I read Knitlandia by Clara Parks. This was a memoir of her, like, kind of little stories all across the world of encountering fiber arts and knitting and creating yarn and dyeing yarn. And a lot of them were very interesting. I gave this book 3 stars because it was kind of hard to read cover to cover. I think if you're going to read this, it should be more of almost a coffee table book that you pick up every so often and treat each story as a separate narrative, not as a book to be read start to finish kind of rapidly. Some of the chapters are very, very long, which I had trouble with because I wasn't prepared to read that much in one chunk. It was okay. I think I liked her other book better, which now I can't remember what it is, but she has another book about taking a fleece from a sheep from start to finish, of like carding it, treating it, turning it into yarn, and then like making a finished product. I think that one was better, but this was still good, especially if you're interested in what knitting looks like around the world. There were a lot of neat anecdotes within this book. Next is the only book that I have the physical copy for, and this is Taylor Swift by the Book, The Literature Behind the Lyrics from Fairy Tales to Tortured Poets by Rachel Feder and Tiffany Tetrow. This book goes through all of Taylor's songs line by line and talks about the literary inspirations or connections behind them. I found this one really interesting. I did treat this as a coffee table book. I just left it literally on my coffee table in my living room and just picked it up whenever I had a few minutes, but didn't make this one of my main books to read for the month. And I think that that was definitely the right way to do it, because it was more digestible to do it just a little bit at a time, because it is very like almost bullet pointed in a way, because it goes through each song line by line. Not every line from every song, but the ones that stick out or have literary importance. But I did really enjoy this. There were a lot more literary connections in her lyrics than I thought there were. So if you're a Taylor Swift fan, but also just a fan of reading, I would highly recommend this book to anyone in those two categories. I gave that one 4 stars just because I wasn't like rapidly consuming it, but it was very, very good. The last book that I read for the month of February was an audiobook again, and it was A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. I read this because I got invited to go on a field trip with my school with some of our middle school students to go see A Midsummer Night's Dream as a stage production, and I hadn't read the play before, so I read it the weekend before. The audio version is 2 hours, so it was perfect to like speed through it. This is a weird play. It definitely made more sense once I saw the stage production, although we saw a shortened version, so it didn't have everything in it. I would say it was enjoyable. I gave it 3 stars just because it is still confusing. There's 3 storylines kind of going on at the same time, which again, if you have a stage production, it makes it much easier to follow. However, in the stage production we happened to see, the same actors were playing different characters in all 3 storylines, so I was glad that the students I was with had already read the play. I think some of the people in the theater hadn't and were confused by the fact that it was the same person playing multiple roles. But it's a good introduction to Shakespeare. It's very comedic, very silly. You're going back and forth between kind of a love triangle quartet situation and things that the fairies are doing, and also a group of workers who are trying to put on a play that just happened to be in the same place as the other 2 storylines going on. So it was entertaining. I would definitely recommend, if you're going to read it, do an audiobook with the printed script in front of you, because the audio version I found did not specify which character was speaking while the story was being read. So I'd recommend having the script in front of you as well if you're going to do that. But the audio did really help solidify what exactly the characters were saying and what the correct intonation was for things, and increased my understanding of the storyline. And then, of course, since it is a play, like, I'd recommend following it up with actually seeing the stage production if you can. But it was a fun field trip, so I'm glad that I did the reading ahead of time so I knew what was going on. Those are all the books that I read for February. I do have a couple of books that I acquired this month that I thought I would share with you. The first one is actually kind of a cookbook. It's called The Flavor Thesaurus. This is what I saw on my mom's kitchen table and went, oh, I need that. I don't know if I will read this cover to cover. It might become my new coffee table book that is just kind of out for me to read a little bit at a time while I'm waiting for something. But this is a book that takes flavors or ingredients and shows you all the different pairings that you can do with them. So if I flip to a random page, like this happens to be the section on artichokes, and it tells you that in pretty good detail all of the different pairings that you can do with artichokes. So like the first section is artichoke and bacon, and it talks about some recipes you can do. Artichoke and lamb, artichoke and lemon, artichoke and pork or mint or shellfish. It just kind of goes through a lot of different options, and I was intrigued by this book because this is more how I cook. I try to think of what flavors I'm looking for and figure out a pairing. So the fact that this is all just pairing things together is really conducive for the way that I plan out meals. So I'm really excited to read this and get some cooking ideas from it. The next book I picked up is from a little library, and it's Shatter the Bones by Stuart McBride. I have mentioned before that I like thrillers that take place on a like reality TV show, and that's definitely what this is. It's a mother-daughter duo who are on like this book's version of American Idol or one of the like singing shows. And then it turns into them going missing and the ransom demands that come out. So I'm intrigued by this one. It definitely fits that category that I've been liking lately, which is why I picked it up. The other two books that I acquired for this month are actually from a small independent bookstore. One of my friends opened a used bookstore, and I decided to go out and support her. She also like hosted a craft night, which is why I went. But I did purchase two books while I was there. This is the first one, and this is one that I had actually been looking for a while. My students really love any books that have anything to do with dragons. So I saw this one on a book list somewhere, saw that it had a dragon on the cover, even though the title has nothing to do with that, and knew that I had to get my hands on it to preview it for my students. So this is The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. I had seen it kind of pitched as an almost steampunk fairy tale. I'm very excited to read this. I also love that the main character's name is September. And on the back, some of the reviews compare it to Wizard of Oz or to fairy tales, so I'm excited to check this one out. The other one I got is this monster of a book. This is the Sword of Shannara trilogy by Terry Brooks, so it's the first 3 books. I know that I read the first Shannara book several years ago, and then I did watch the Netflix show that was available briefly, even though I know that it did not fully tie in with the books. And I did enjoy both. The show less. I also saw the show first and didn't know that the first book in the trilogy is not where they started the show. The show starts with the second or even the third book in the series or something like that. But I've been kind of wanting to give these a reread for a while, so when I saw the first 3 books all in one volume, I knew I had to pick it up. And that's it for February reads. Those are my book acquisitions and everything I read. I already have several other books in progress at the moment, so I'm excited to finish those up and tell you all about them next month. If you liked what you watched today, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below so you can be notified of all my videos right here on YouTube, both book-related and craft-related. If you want to follow me on other social media sites, that information will be in the description box below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.